said, today I'll be, of course, moving on to talk about United States entry into World War II. Of course, we get involved because of the fact that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. We've kind of started talking about World War II, at least in Europe. They were already fighting at that point, going back to 1939. Of course, and in Asia, they were already fighting back in 1937 with Japan fighting China. So I'll kind of talk about that also as well. And first, I'm going to get into and talk about how the United States got into World War II, which a lot of it had to do with the Japanese. Japan became like a fascist state too, just like Germany and Italy did in Europe. They became very militarized as a power, and like the military, controlled a lot of the government, of course. Like eventually, I think under Hideki Tojo, they pretty much peaked as a fascist type government, and I'll get to it later, but like I said, the reason why we get in World War II is because Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, which is a famous natural harbor, which was used for the U.S. Pacific Fleet that was based there in the Central Pacific. And so when the Japanese attacked it on December 7th, 1941, that, of course, got us in the war. We declared war on Japan, by the way, on December 8th, 1941. Now, you can go back before that, though. If you study about, the history of, really Asia and all that with the Japanese were starting to build an empire in parts of Asia. They already, by the way, had taken over Korea in the early I think by 1908, I want to say, the Japanese had taken control of Korea. So the whole peninsula was controlled by the Japanese at one point. They also had Taiwan. Most people don't know that. Taiwan was actually where Taipei is, basically was controlled by the Japanese for a short time. And they also took over Manchuria by 1931 as well, which was kind of like a Japanese puppet state that was called Manchukuo. So the Japanese had this idea to create like an empire that was throughout Asia, the Pacific, which was supposed to be like an Asia for Asians, but with the Japanese as being more superior. The Japanese were very racist, kind of still are, kind of xenophobic a little bit today still, and they kind of view themselves, the Japanese people, as being superior to other Asiatic peoples. So it's kind of funny because the Americans saw the Japanese as, being inferior to them. They can't see the yellow peril and things like that, they called them. So it's kind of funny how both kind of saw themselves as kind of being superior like that. Of course, one of the big things that happened that really got, Japan really like on our bad side, more or less, was Japan and China got into a big war in 1937, which was called the Second Sino-Japanese War. It was actually the longest conflict that was actually in World War II. In fact, some believe that World War II started in Asia with this conflict and resulted in something like 10 million deaths, especially like Chinese that were killed in the war. And in that conflict, the Japanese tried to take over a good bit of the Chinese mainland, especially the eastern part where all their main port cities were. So from Hong Kong all the way to Nanking. The Japanese had overrun other countries. They took over China. Then, of course, they took over Southeast Asia, tried to take over Thailand, took over the Philippines. Later, they even take over the Western Pacific as well. So, they overrun it pretty much from, I want to say, 1937 to 1941, which was the peak of Japan's conquests, where they would take over that part of Asia. So they're really trying to expand their empire. A lot of the reasons why the Japanese did this was because of the fact that Japan lacked natural resources. It's mostly just a bunch of islands, and so that's why they need to conquer these areas so they could have natural resources and so on to expand their empire. Yeah, of course, the U.S. supported, the British, even the Soviet Union, by the way, sent military aid, of course, to China. All that's, of course, the U.S. was kind of, really concerned about this because the fact that, we had traded with China, open trade going back to, I guess, 1900, going back to John Hay's open door policy. And we supported this leader of China who was named Chiang Kai-shek. You may have heard of him. He was like the president of China under the Republic. He was also head of the Kuomintang, which was the Chinese Nationalist Party that was in China, which had formed the Republic of China back in 1912. And Chiang Kai-shek was our biggest supporter up to like, I want to say 1949. But he was actually rivaled by this other Chineseman named Mao Zedong, who was head of the communists in China that you have. They were kind of rivals. We kind of supported him too, but we didn't like him as much as Chiang Kai-shek. And those two would end up being enemies after the war, but they kind of set aside their differences to fight against the Japanese when they invaded. But later they'll fight it out. You know about this. The Chinese Republican forces of Chiang Kai-shek later fight Mao Zedong. And it happens later, so-called Chinese Civil War, they call it later. Mao Zedong and the communists end up winning. Of course, it leads to the People's Republic of China forming in 1949. Of course, Chiang Kai-shek later fled to Taiwan, where they created the Republic of China, of course, on Taiwan, as they call it now. So, yeah, you see here now the Japanese are kind of seen as a threat to, the United States. We're kind of angered, over Japanese aggression in parts of China and so on. And so one of the things that's going to happen is that it's going to lead to several things that kind of help to obviously irritate the Japanese that lead to war in late 1941. There's two things I'll give you that the Americans did that kind of annoyed the Japanese. One was we sent military aid, not just, material or whatever, like, arsenal democracy. We sent also men. There were cases where they had volunteer pilots that were sent over to fight with the Chinese Air Force. And if you know about this, it led to the so-called Flying Tigers being formed. They called the AVG, or the American Volunteer Group. And it was led by this man named Claire Chennault, who I've got a picture of. And here he is right here. Chennault, who was from Texas, by the way, was a famous Army general. And he was he was brought in to create some kind of air force that could help the Chinese fight the Japanese. The Japanese had a pretty good air force. And he actually went to LSU, Louisiana State University, for about a year, but he dropped out, I think, to join the military. And so he called them later the Flying Tigers, named after the LSU Tigers, I guess. And so hence the name being used. And the Flying Tigers were famous for their, I think these are some of the early planes they used, like the P-40 Warhawk, which were famous for the tiger's teeth, of course. You see right there with it. I think downtown in Baton Rouge, they have one down there where the USS Kidd is, which is a famous destroyer from World War II. And there's one hanging up, by the way, in the museum for the USS Kidd. So that's kind of one of those planes that were there that fought with them, more or less. So that was one thing that kind of annoyed, the Japanese. And then, of course, if you know about the big thing that happened too, was in July of 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt, under the federal government in the United States, decided to put an embargo on Japan to try to force them out of China, get them out. And so you can see they banned things like fuel being sent to them, shipped over, oil, steel, any kind of scrap metal that could be used against us or anybody else, China or whatever. And so they think that's part of what caused a lot of the strain between the United States and Japan that eventually led to World War II, because it's going to cause them to retaliate and attack us, which they will. Because Japan was kind of, this kind of hurt their military in parts of, Asia Pacific, which they relied on some of these sources for their military. And so that's part of why they attack, different parts of that world, like in the Asia and the Pacific, to go after various natural resources like oil, fuel, rubber, things like that, that their military, of course, needed. Yeah, I think so. It is. It's named after him, which is true, at Lake Charles, Louisiana. That's correct. So yeah, there's like air bases and things like that that are named after Chenault, of course, today. Yeah, that's true about that. So anyway, so let me get into what happened next. So the Japanese, what occurred next was they began to plan to attack the United States, which led to the attack on Pearl Harbor, which you can see right here, which happened December 7th, 1941. It took Japanese a while to plan this, by the way, going back a couple of months. And it was planned mostly by the head of the Japanese Navy, which was Admiral Yamamoto. He was head of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And they got the idea to attack the United States using dive bombers and torpedo bombers from, I think the British had used this against the Italians in Italy. And so they kind of came up with this idea to do the same thing. And they actually practiced. They actually had some kind of deal where they used some kind of natural harbor in the northern part of Japan to actually train for this, where they planned like to kind of, I guess, attack a mock naval squadron that was there. And what happened was the Japanese amassed a huge task force, which involved 6 aircraft carriers. It's called the so-called First Air Fleet. And you can see the actual aircraft carriers are used: Kagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shikaku, and Zukaku. And Japan, by the way, did not have as many battleships. They had actually put more of their naval components into building carriers, which, if you know about World War II, in the Pacific, it's mostly famous for having a lot of carrier battles, like the Battle of Midway, etc., which become very strategic during the war. Of course, today it's still like that. Aircraft carriers become pretty much the main thing, and battleships are really not important like they used to be. But the Japanese were hoping to take out our Pacific fleet, which was located in Oahu, in Hawaii. And so that was the plan. They thought if they could take our fleet out, that would force us to basically sue for peace. So they kind of went with this preemptive strike against the United States, which a lot of Americans thought as a sneak attack. But the Japanese were actually going to declare war on us and then attack us. But for some reason, they couldn't get the declaration of war to us soon enough because of issues with translation between Japanese and English. It's kind of crazy. Now, their main target, by the way, was Battleship Row, which you can see here in this picture. There, of course, is where the ships were anchored, by the way, on the eve of the attack. And Battleship Row is located right here. So this area right here from the California all the way to the Nevada, east of what is Ford Island. It's a natural harbor on Oahu, where Honolulu is, just nearby. And so the Japanese were trying to attack these ships here, primarily to take these out. They also, I think, attacked some of these over here as well. But those are the main ones that they went after. And yeah, those are the main battleships right there: Oklahoma, Maryland, Utah, California, West Virginia, Tennessee, Nevada, and Arizona. So those are all kind of east of Ford Island that you're looking at. There are actually 2 separate ways of attack planes that came in from the north. There are actually cases where they actually saw it on radar coming in. Some people had radar in the northern part of the island on Oahu, but they thought it was a bunch of B-17s coming in, which actually there were. There were some B-17s that were coming in at the same time, and so they got fooled by it. Anyway, in the attack, they went after, you can see the air bases, and they also went after Pearl Harbor, where the main Pacific Fleet was. And in the attack, about 18 ships were either damaged or destroyed. 2,400 men, mostly sailors, were killed in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, by the way, is considered one of the worst naval disasters in American history. It's like one of our worst naval defeats we've ever suffered. And the USS Arizona, probably the most famous ship that was hit, at Pearl Harbor, was totally destroyed. It's now obviously a museum, as you know, and a memorial site, and loss of life of something like 80–90% of the crew were killed on the Arizona when it went down. Oklahoma was also another ship that was also destroyed as well. It actually almost flipped over and capsized. And so both those ships, by the way, Arizona and Oklahoma, were never refloated after that. I think all the other ships that were damaged were fixed up and fought in the war. But those two were destroyed. And most of the men that were killed, by the way, like half of them, were killed on the Arizona. Oh, in Baton Rouge, they have a ship called the USS Kidd. By the way, people think it's named after Captain Kidd, which is kind of like its mascot. It's actually named after Isaac Kidd, who was a rear admiral, who, by the way, had his flagship on the Arizona. He got blown up. He got killed in the attack. He died. And so they named the ship after him. That's where the name came, that destroyer. Just in back. That's why I got it, because it's famous because of that. So he was in the war, and I think he was also involved in a kamikaze attack, I know, Pacific later in the war of the USS Kidd. So if you haven't visited that in Baton Rouge, you ought to go take a look at it as well, which is pretty neat. Kind of a remnant of the war and all that. But so that would cause, the United States, because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S., like I said, would declare war on Japan, December 8th, 1941. Of course, we already showed you that little short video clip, of course, where Franklin D. Roosevelt, in a very short speech, declared war on the Japanese. They saw it as kind of like a dastardly attack, by the way. It was like a sneak attack, and all that. And so a lot of Americans were furious against the Japanese. And I guess the negative side about that, if you know about what happened with the beginning of the war, is that a lot of Japanese Americans were actually interned in like internment camps because of that. But a lot of Americans didn't trust them. They thought they had enemies within their own people, and so that's why they did that. So, and I think the Japanese some had even spied on us and given information to the Japanese to help the attack in Hawaii, which was something that was true, by the way. Due to the fact that Germany and Italy were part of the Axis powers, guess what? A few days later, December 11th, they declared war on the United States. And so now the United States was at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. We'd have to fight a two-front war, Pacific and also Europe, Africa. And so that's something that the United States is going to, of course, get into and do. Oh, I didn't know that. I have to check that out, which is on the USS Kidd. I have to check. Okay, yeah, I heard about that movie coming out by Tom Hanks. That should be interesting. Try to see that. So that's neat. So anyway, let me go ahead and, of course, talk about, we'll shift gears. So, yeah, so that's how we got involved in the war. I do have some other pictures if you want to look at, by the way. That's actually a picture of the attack, when they got attacked, by the way, that the Japanese took when they attacked Pearl Harbor right there. I think here's some other pictures. That's the picture of the Arizona that blew up. Yeah, literally you can see when it blew up, that debris in smoke and fire went into the air, and the actual ship got hit in its magazine. It actually came out of the water, literally, it blew up. And the actual Arizona kept burning till, I want to say, Christmas time. And most of the ship was removed, except for the bottom part of it. And, of course, they made a memorial out of it, of course, later. There's the Oklahoma. You see it capsized, which was right here. And a lot of men died from that. They got trapped inside of it. And they actually had men that had to use torches to try to cut their way into it. And they were able to free some men, but a lot of men weren't able to get out, of course, in the Oklahoma. That's the USS Shaw, which I want to say was a destroyer, which was in dry dock. It blew up into a fireball, but nobody was on it. But it's kind of, I think, considered one of the biggest explosions that was hit. That was with that right there. So yeah, now of course we're in the war, of course, with that. Right, now let me get into and talk about also, the United States involvement in the war. It took us a while, like not really till I want to say 1942, that the United States really got involved in World War II. We mostly first participated, if you know about this, the North African campaign. If you know about North Africa at the time, Hitler was trying to take over North Africa because he wanted control of Egypt and the Suez Canal. And Erwin Rommel, who was a famous general on the German side, they called him the Desert Fox. He formed this Army Corps, which was composed of mostly Germans and Italians. That was dubbed the Africa Corps. And it was like a tank army and with trucks. And they mostly tried to use the coastal areas of North Africa to take Libya and then march their way into Egypt. Well, they were repulsed. You know about this Battle of El Alamein in October of 1942. And what happened was the Americans came in to help out the British. It's kind of a partial entry into the war to help them fight the Germans. That was so-called Operation Torch, as it's called. So we got involved in that. And that was basically the Allied invasion of what is French North Africa, because the French, going back to before the war, had controlled like Morocco and Algeria. And what happened was it was controlled by the Vichy France, or French government, which was a type of pro-fascist French government that had been in power since 1940. It was led by Philippe Pétain. So we invaded there. We hoped the French would actually switch sides and not fight us when we went in there, because I think it looked like the Germans were starting to lose the war in 1942. And the operation was led by these two generals, mostly Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, who, of course, everybody calls Ike later, who was later president of the United States in the 1950s. And you probably heard of George S. Patton. He was, of course, one of the most famous generals that fought on the American side in the war, who fought in North Africa, Sicily, and also in Europe. Patton was called Old Blood and Guts. And Patton was really the best general we had probably throughout the war. Anyway, what happened was the French forces of the Vichy government eventually switched sides. I think at first when we landed our forces there in Morocco and Algeria, they actually attacked us. But they decided that they didn't really want to fight us, so they switched sides to the American side. So Operation Torch was pretty important. Now, they think it helped to lead to Germany's collapse in North Africa, because Rommel's forces eventually were surrounded. They were surrounded by the British and Americans around Tunisia by the spring of 1943. So Rommel was forced to give up and fly back to Germany. And a lot of his forces got captured, which was true. So that's initially the first thing I guess we did against the Germans really in the war. And I think I thought I had some other slides on this, which are right here, which you can see. But you can see in that map right there, that's about where we would land our forces. Like you may have heard of Casablanca, I think it was like kind of in that same area you may have heard of, was where we fought predominantly. I think Oran, too, was another area. Oran, I think it was as well. There's, of course, another way. Yeah, Casablanca, Oran, Algiers, also right here. So all those areas were basically taken by us pretty much. Now, also, the other thing, of course, that was very famous at the beginning of the war against the Germans was also into Italy. The Americans also supported what was later the invasion of Italy, which a bunch of powers were involved in the Italian campaign and trying to take that back from the Germans and the Italian fascists. The idea of the Italian campaign was an idea of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They had this idea that if they could attack up through Italy, they'd knock the Italian fascists out of the war. and then they could use Italy as a springboard to attack Germany from the south. That was the point, what they wanted to try to do. And so this led to what they call Operation Husky that happened around July of 1943. Operation Husky was an Allied invasion of Sicily, which involved really mostly two main powers, which were the United States and also the British, who were led mostly by these two generals, George S. Patton, the American side, and of course Montgomery was probably one of the most famous generals that fought in the European theater on their side. Everybody called it Monty, and both Patton and Montgomery were great at tank warfare and all that. And that was important. They took Sicily, and it forced the Germans and the Italians to basically back off of Sicily and retreat back into Italy. And what happened was the Italian government didn't really see much in Benito Mussolini being in power anymore. And so they had him sacked. You know about that. They forced him to step down and imprisoned him. And but Hitler didn't want to give up on Italy. He was kind of concerned that, like I said, that the Allies were going to use Italy as a springboard to go into Germany up through Austria. And so Hitler decided to continue the war in Italy on their own. So the Germans actually practically just took over Italy, basically. I think he actually freed Mussolini, kind of freed him from prison and all that. That led to the so-called Italian campaign, which would last, by the way, from 1943 to lasted almost 2 years, by the way. And the Italian campaign was pretty bloody. They had like close to about, I want to say, 2 million deaths in World War II in Italy between like both sides combined. And the culmination of the whole conflict, if you know about this, was the fact that about a year later, the Allies were able to take the capital of Rome. June, I forget what day. Yeah, it looks like June 4th, 1944. And Rome was one of like the three main, Axis capitals that would be captured during the war. I think they first got, this one first, Rome, and then later Berlin, and then I think Tokyo was the last one, of course, to fall, of course, in 1945. So a lot of people talk about, I don't really go as much into Italy, but Italy is like this so-called forgotten war that most people don't know much about. We can study about it more. But it's one of those wars that people kind of forgot about. And it was actually famous for all these different powers fighting there, like all over. They had troops from India. They had black African-American troops that fought there. I think they had some Japanese-American forces that actually fought Italy that they kind of recruited to fight there as well. It's kind of interesting how they all these different people. But they did that because they had all these other forces that were kind of training to invade France, which, of course, is the next thing, of course, that happens after that. But yeah, Italy later, what happened to Mussolini, by the way? Mussolini would later get captured at the end of the war. And I think Hitler tried to set him up as this kind of fascist dictator in northern Italy. But as the war ended in 1945, he was actually captured and he was executed. I think they hung him up by his toes, basically. I think they killed him with his mistress. He was like next to him right there, of course, in the picture. So he's later killed at the end of the war, Mussolini, if you wonder what happened to him and all of that. So yeah, let me get into next. And of course, we're going to talk about D-Day, of course, which, is one of the most famous events that really, I guess, happens with the United States involvement in Europe in World War II. And so, yeah, in 1944, the United States began planning with the British and other powers to kind of create a second front. If you know about the Soviets were fighting the Germans on the Eastern Front, mostly like in Russia, Ukraine, into Poland. And so they, I think Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union had wanted the Americans to open up another front with the British. And so the United States began planning this operation to invade and basically, take France back from the Germans, who had occupied it since 1940. So they've been occupied like 4 years by them. And the invasion of France was often called different names. They call it sometimes the D-Day invasion, or just really D-Day. They call it for short, you know. But a lot of people also call it Operation Overlord, which you can see as well. And Operation Overlord was the code name for the Allied operation where the British, Americans, some French, and others, I think the Polish forces were involved, and some like Free Polish people, I think, were involved, where they invaded Western Europe into France. And it was actually a two-pronged attack. There was one like from the north, which was, you know, into Normandy. They actually had one called Operation Dragoon, where they attacked from the south in the Mediterranean coast as well. But Izad is talk about Overlord. Overlord was launched on June 6th, 1944. The so-called Normandy landings, as they're called. You can see that's the initial force that was used. Something like 160,000 troops were used. Many of them were, by the way, trained in Britain and also in America. Involved over 5,000 vessels, and I think several thousand aircraft were also involved in like bombardments. Also, they used not amphibious. They used also gliders to bring forces in. But they also used airborne units as well involved in it. You can see by August of 1944, about 2 million men were brought in to invade into France. So it was a huge, you know, military force that they usually pushed into France at that point. The AEF, which was actually called the Allied Expeditionary Force, was led by Eisenhower, I talked about previously, who said was later president. And he was picked as the leader because he was kind of seen as a great leader of men. But also the fact that about 2/3 of the forces that invaded into France were American. I think I want to say almost 60% or more were American forces. And the rest were French, some mostly British after that. And mostly British and French were involved, like the Free French forces were involved. Canadian, I think there were some Free Polish forces that also invaded as well. They landed on multiple beaches in Normandy. I've got a map showing you more of the landing beaches right here on the English Channel. Normandy is located in the northern part of France today. And of course, there was a debate about where the invasion was going to come. The Germans actually thought that the invasion was going to come about right here where Calais is, across from the Strait of Dover. But the Americans thought that that would be too obvious of a location to attack. So they actually decided to attack here, right in that area right here. And anyway, there were multiple landing beaches. They had, of course, the Americans landed at 2 sector beaches, which were called Omaha in Utah. Omaha, of course, being the most famous, the bloodiest of the different beaches where the Americans came ashore. I think in the first wave, something like 1,000 or 2,000 men were killed and wounded initially. Then the British and Canadian forces landed at 3 other beaches called Gold, Sword, and Juno as well. You can also see like different airborne being used. Like the Americans had the 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne divisions that also kind of participated. The British had some too. They were also involved. That actually either parachuted in or they had gliders that they used as well. And some of the airborne units, by the way, were used to take strategic roads or bridges, things like that, that were kind of vital in the actual initial invasion when they came in. They always talk about, by the way, the famous Higgins boats. I don't know if you heard about the Higgins boats, but these were famous boats that were used in the amphibious invasions. They were created by this boat manufacturer from New Orleans. You may have heard of him, named Andrew Higgins. And he created the Higgins boats. They're also called the LCVP landing craft. Anyway, in Louisiana, we used these because, you know, Louisiana is notorious for having a lot of marshes and swamps and things like that. And so we started using it for that. And it was also used in the Pacific as well. So you had ship little boats like that that could bring men ashore to attack, you know, on beaches, basically. And Hitler kind of saw, by the way, Andrew Higgins as the so-called new Noah, is what he called it. He thought he kind of helped to change the war, basically, because, if the Allied forces had been repulsed at Normandy, that could have played a major role in maybe the Germans winning the war. But they were able to get ashore eventually. And the Battle of Normandy was important because Normandy led to basically the fall of Paris. It was actually liberated by August 25th. And that would eventually force the Germans to start backing up towards Belgium and also what is Germany, like in the Rhine River and all that. So that campaign, really the Battle of Normandy was the bloodiest conflict really we fought in World War II. I think we had like a total of like 21,000 men killed, by the way, in the Battle of Normandy, with about 124,000 casualties totally, like killed, wounded, captured, whatever, basically. By the way, Operation Overlord, part of why it was successful was that they had this operation you may have heard about. It was called Operation Bodyguard. It's called all kinds of different names. They called it, but the Allies came up with this idea to kind of use deception to fool the Germans on where the location of the actual invasion was. So if you know what they did was they created fake armies, like the first U.S. Army group, which was supposedly led by George Patton, were kind of created to kind of trick the Germans into thinking that the invasion would be near Calais, near the Strait of Dover. And they used like a lot of these rubber like tanks, boats, planes to kind of fool people and all that. So it'd be like in movies and things like that. And the Germans really fooled by it and all that. And we kind of tricked them into not knowing where the location would be and all that. So that's kind of vital later, what happens with the war, with the invasion. Well, that's good, Ross. Cool. That's about that. That's cool. Iwo Jima. So that's kind of a neat thing. So yeah, this guy, of course, invented, the so-called Higgins boats. All right. So anyway, so yeah, let me also talk about, of course, what happened. So yeah, so you got that occur next, of course. Now, what happened was like I said, the Germans basically began retreating toward like the Belgium and the German border. And so they're kind of sandwiched between what is, the allies of the Americans, the British, coming from the West. They got the Soviets invading from the East through Poland, through Hungary as well. So it looks like the Germans are going to get smashed from two different sides, two fronts at that point. And one of the things that happened, here's some more pictures, by the way, of that landing craft you're talking about, LCVP, of course, which is right there. But one of the things that happened is the Battle of the Bulge, which is well known, by the way, at the end of World War II. Besides Normandy, the other big battle that the United States fought in World War II was that battle. One of my grandfathers fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Actually, my wife's grandfather really would be, I guess, by marriage, but he fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Anyway, what happened was Hitler realized that they were going to get smashed from the east, and so he was hoping to take out the British and the Americans. And so one of the things that Hitler decided to do was a winter offensive through what is the Ardennes Forest, which is in Belgium and France. And I didn't really go into it previously, talking about the European war aspect of World War II, but in 1940, Hitler, if you know about this, had broken through the Ardennes in May of 1940. It's part of why the French and the British lost, like in France, and they lost, Netherlands and Belgium and all that. And so Hitler thought he could do that again, like in 1944. And so Hitler amassed like whatever kind of tanks and force that he could in the West, and it led to the Battle of the Bulge, which was called different names. I think the Germans called it the Watch on the Rhine or something like that, or Operation Watch on the Rhine. And some people do call it the Battle Battle of the Ardennes, I think some people call it that, but not usually. But why do they call it the Bulge? Well, they call it Battle of the Bulge because the fact that what happened when the Germans broke through part of the Allied defense lines, it formed a huge bulge in their Allied lines. And so the newspapers started calling it that, Battle of the Bulge. And at one point in what is part of Belgium, there was a city called Bastion, which was surrounded, which American forces were basically trying to defend that city. And Bastion was kind of important, by the way. It was like this crossroads town where the Germans would have taken it. They would have been able to march all the way to, like, I want to say the North Sea in the English Channel. I think their objective was to take Antwerp, if you read about it. And one of the American generals there, whose name was General McAuliffe, refused to surrender. They actually asked him to surrender his forces because he was surrounded. And he replied back with the famous message, nuts, which the Germans couldn't understand what the hell he meant by that. And so General, they call him Anthony Nuts McAuliffe, I think was his name later. And so that was kind of, how the Americans refused to really, surrender to the Germans. And so that became a turning point later, the Battle of the Bulge. Later, I think Patton's Third Army helped to kind of relieve the Bulge. Now, what eventually happens is by the spring of 1945, they believe that, I want to say by March, it was, the Americans and the British were able to cross the Rhine River into Western Germany. That helps precipitate the fall of the Third Reich. Then you got the Soviets, of course, invading from the east and south also as well. The last big battle they actually have of course, there's another picture of the Battle of the Bulge. You can see actually where it came from. You can see there we had like maps they would show where it had kind of a bulge in it. And so you can see why they dubbed it that name, which is right here. But yeah, they wanted to get to Antwerp because they had a lot of supplies there that the Allies had that they could use against them. And so that could have, altered the war and all that. But Berlin, Battle of Berlin, which was fought between April to May of 1945, is really our last pivotal battle that they have of the war in Europe. And what happened was the Soviets basically invaded the eastern part of Germany, and Berlin fell. It was like an urbanized battle, which was pretty bloody too. And Hitler, they think, killed himself. At least that's the theory they believe. He was in his bunker April 30th. They think he shot himself, supposedly. And some people think he did. That's kind of all kinds of theories about that I know today. I think the Germans said he died in battle, fighting against the Soviets and all that. But they think the death of Hitler and the taking of Berlin pretty much helps to end, World War II in Europe. And so the Germans began surrendering at that point afterwards at the end of the war. Band of Brothers, that's a great series, by the way. If you ever want to watch it, of course, from the HBO series, which kind of depicts, especially like, was it Easy Company and all that fought, of course, which I think it was that Screaming Eagles, I think were involved in that, which was pretty good. So yeah, I've got that series actually at home, which is pretty good. So Battle of Berlin's kind of important. It of course leads to the fall of Germany. Now, what's going to happen later after with Hitler dead? They do have what they call it's called VE Day. I can find it right here, but there it is right there. VE Day. There's different dates on it, but it actually should be May 8th, 1945 is the actual date when Germany begins surrendering to the Allies. It is 101st Airborne. You're correct about that. The Germans began surrendering. Actually, May 7th they began surrendering, actually. But May 8th actually is the official date of when I think they talk about how the Germans start surrendering at that point. Victory in Europe Day. After that, what's going to happen later is that Germany's going to be carved up It's going to be basically occupied by the Allies after the war. The British, the French, the Americans will occupy it. And then what's going to happen after that is that the Soviets will occupy the eastern part. So all areas that they kind of invade into and occupy, that's going to lead to basically Germany being, pretty much, occupied throughout the Cold War. So it's going to be one of the main issues that leads to the Cold War, of course, later that you have. Now, I'm going to get to it later, but we're going to get more into Japan, getting into the war. That's going to be our next thing we'll talk about, of course, later in the week. Probably won't do it today because I'm not really ready for that lecture, but I'll talk about how the United States is going to eventually fight, of course, the Japanese. They got the so-called Pacific Campaign, or I think a lot of people call it the Pacific War, is what they usually called it, which was fought between 1941 to 45, which really starts with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And it goes all the way to September 2nd, 1945, when the Japanese surrendered in Tokyo Bay on the USS Missouri. And so the Japanese, by the way, at least up to I want to say 1941, 42, did pretty good. But they got victory disease. You know about that. They start losing. I think Yamamoto had said that for maybe 6 months they could fight the Americans toe to toe. But after that, he thought they pretty much awakened a sleeping giant. And so Americans would build battleships like that behind me, like the USS Alabama. Many of these kind of ships like that. And the Alabama had a crew of over 3,000 men. They were on it. It's amazing. You have to maybe tour that ship one day in Mobile Bay. But it was like a floating hotel kind of battle wagon, if you want to call it that. And the guns on it are huge, ridiculous. I think it's got 6 guns in the front and 3 in the back. Anyway, but so I'll get more into World War II later in the week on Thursday. On Thursday, I'll kind of talk about mostly the Pacific War. And if I have any time, I'll probably talk maybe a little bit about the early part of the Cold War as well. So before I go, a reminder about a few things, of course, about assignments. I told you earlier that the so-called, I think it's the first exam, I believe it's still open right now. It's still, I think I've got it open. I want to say today or whatever it is, but if you haven't wrapped that up, try to get that done because you do have the second exam coming up as well to kind of wrap up on for that's coming up. The second exam is going to cover, I think I told you, from World War I, Roaring '20s, and also the Great Depression, New Deal era. So you got to get that done. And then I'll have probably other material later. Maybe we can add one more quiz. I don't know. We'll see how it goes because the semester's kind of coming, pretty quick and all that. I know. But for now, this month, you need to concentrate on getting that second exam done and, of course, the research paper done also as well. So that's it for today. Kind of a horrible day here, by the way. The weather's really bad. But I'll see you later in the week on Thursday for our Part 2 lecture, of course, on World War II, which will concentrate on the Japanese aspect of the war. So that's it for today. Y'all take care. I'll see you, like I said, later in the week.